who is a wise counselor and who is a foolish counselor, because sometimes foolish people, foolish counselors, are actually trying to mislead you from making a good decision. That is just one of the interesting takeaways from today's reading. Today we are looking at 2 Samuel 16 to 18, and we're basically continuing to follow this idea of Absalom going to war with David. So 2 days ago, we read 2 Samuel 15, and we saw that Jerusalem was under siege. David had to flee the city so that the city would not be destroyed. Today we are picking up that story in 2 Samuel 16. And basically, there's two really interesting side stories that happen here in 16. The first one is that Ziba, who was partnered up and taking care of Mephibosheth. If you remember Mephibosheth, he was the one who was a descendant of Saul, who was lame in both legs because he had been injured while people were fleeing a battle. And David showed him kindness by allowing him to eat at his table and maintain a lot of his lands, which would not have been common or normal at all. It would have been very common for David to kill all of Saul's descendants, and so it's an odd act of kindness of David toward Mephibosheth. While they are fleeing the city, Ziba rides up and says basically, hey, Mephibosheth is planning to take all his lands back, and he's hoping that Saul's kingdom is restored to himself. David hears this. It's sort of odd timing. David is literally running away for his life, so it seems like kind of an odd sidetrack. And David says, fine, you can take all of Mephibosheth's lands. I can't believe that guy is turning against me. You can have what is his. I don't care. I'm thinking about something else. Now, this will be interesting to us because in 2 Samuel 19, which we'll get to in a couple of days, we find out that Ziba is not being completely honest, and David most likely made a rash decision here because he was obviously concerned about other things. It seems like Ziba is deceiving David to take advantage of Mephibosheth. We actually find out that Ziba actually stole Mephibosheth's donkey or mule, and Mephibosheth was planning on riding out of the city. So Ziba just left that guy in the city that is under siege, in danger, showing no concern for him at all, to deceive David to try to take over David's lands. So that is side quest number one. Side quest number two has to do with this guy named Shimei, who is out in the countryside as the people are fleeing Jerusalem, and he is throwing rocks at David and throwing rocks at David's attendants and advisors, and he's cursing him. He's saying, hey, you're a man of blood, you stole Saul's kingdom, and God is judging you for it. This is an interesting story because the people that are defending David actually asked David, hey, can we run up there and cut off that guy's head? He's annoying. Which might be an overreaction. I'm not sure. And David says, hey, I think that God is telling him to curse me. And if God is telling him to curse me, we don't want to interrupt what God has asked him to do. It seems like David is dealing still with some guilt and some sense of responsibility for everything that is happening that has come out of his sin with Bathsheba. So this is the second day of reading on the podcast that has to do with David's sin with Bathsheba. I know so many times we highlight that David was repentant and God forgave him, and we make it seem like everything was fine. But here we have David still dealing with deep consequences from his sin, from his rejection of God. And so David lets this guy curse him. He lets him shout at him. He lets him disrespect him. And David is kind of taking it as this opportunity to be humble and show his humility before God and before all these people. I'm sure David's army was somewhat confused. Then we have Absalom marching into Jerusalem. He finally takes over the city. And if you are unaware of how kings and kingdoms worked at that time, the end of chapter 16 is going to be very odd to you. Basically, what Absalom does is he goes up on the roof of the palace. He sets up a tent there, and he goes into David's concubines and basically just starts sleeping with David's concubines, which seems not appropriate and kind of strange. But in that time, people would have understood that he was basically commanding the kingdom. He was doing this. He was having sex with the concubines to show that he was the one in charge now. He was the new king, and he was claiming that authority over the kingdom. This would have been very common, and it would have actually strengthened the people that were serving Absalom, which is exactly what Absalom says he wants to do. And so Absalom, by sleeping with David's concubines, is declaring himself the sole ruler of Israel, and many people are lining up to serve him because of that. So this is, it's an odd thing that we don't necessarily understand today, but he is claiming authority in a very public, very clear way. This was also prophesied by Nathan in 2 Samuel 12:11. Nathan said this would happen to the exact degree. Exactly what he said would happen is happening. So then we go into this story of two counselors. This is really interesting. We have Ahithophel, who was a very popular and very wise counselor for Absalom. In 2 Samuel 17, it actually talks about how people believed that he had godly wisdom that came from the Lord, and he was wise in the wisdom that he shared. And so we have kind of this episode of Ahithophel versus Hushai. Hushai is somebody who has been loyal to David. He has served David well, and he has counseled David well. And the first thing Absalom says to him is, I don't know if I should trust you because you were loyal to my father. How do I know you're going to be loyal to me? And he basically just, in a split second, says that he'll be loyal to Absalom. So Hushai suggests that Absalom should lead the army himself. He should take some time to gather more troops, and they should rush out against David when they have a larger army. Ahithophel has suggested that Absalom stay back and they go after David immediately. And so there's these two different thoughts and different kinds of advice. And really, Ahithophel, if Absalom would have followed what he said, most likely would have been successful. He gives the best advice. But Absalom, because he is a prideful person, we've seen this as the story has developed, he is susceptible to Hushai's advice because Hushai is just consistently telling him, like, Absalom, you're so great, you're so wonderful, you're the best king we've ever had. Like, it's kind of interesting how this super powerful guy that's literally leading this army against David, he's so susceptible to people stroking his ego. So he loves that Hushai is making him sound wonderful, and so he brings the two pieces of advice to his advisors. He has like this whole team of people, I guess, and they choose to go with Hushai instead of Ahithophel. And really what that does is it seals the deal, because now Absalom is going to lead the army himself. That's going to put him in harm's way. He's also, by gathering more troops, going to allow David a lot more time to get to where he wants to fight the battle, where he will have the upper hand. It also allows David more time to plan and figure out how he's going to fight. And ultimately, it causes Absalom to lose. So when Ahithophel realizes that Absalom does not want to listen to his advice anymore, he literally goes home and hangs himself. He has no authority left in the kingdom. He has no meaning left to his position. And so he kills himself. And so what we have here is kind of this step-by-step destruction of Absalom. Ahithophel has been a key advisor to him. He is now separated from him. And now Absalom is putting himself in harm's way to go after David. So the battle erupts in this forest. David stays back in the city because his army has asked him to do so. And before the army goes out against Absalom, David says, hey, please be gracious to my son. I want you to show kindness to him. I want you to, be gracious to him because he's my son. I love my son. And so the army goes out against Absalom. There's this odd thing that happens to him. Absalom is apparently riding through the forest, and he is on a mule and gets stuck in a tree. Apparently, Absalom's army was not very good at fighting in the woods. The Bible actually says that more people died by the hands of the forest than swords. I don't know exactly how that works, but Absalom ends up tangled up in a tree by his hair, which is really interesting because in 2 Samuel 14:26, we see that his long, beautiful hair was a source of pride to him. And so it is his pride that has caused him to stumble in this battle. He gets tangled up in a tree. People, for some period of time, refused to hurt him because of what David had said. And finally, Joab grabs a couple of javelins and goes up and kills Absalom and the threat to David's power is now over, and David remains king in Israel. What's interesting is there's some conversation about who should go back and tell David. Everyone is rightfully fearful to go and tell David because they have killed his son, and David had asked them to be gracious to his son. And so one messenger goes back and says, hey, everything is fine. The next messenger goes back and says, hey, your son is dead. And as soon as David hears that his son is dead, he does not rejoice that the kingdom has come back into his power. He is mourning the death of his son. He's obviously overcome with grief. It says, the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. As he wept, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you." And so what we have here is the end of Absalom's revolt, but also the fruit of the sin of David, I think, has kind of, that first episode has come to completion. Exactly what Nathan said, what happened has happened. It's taken a couple years, but now David has two sons who have been, killed by the sword, or in this case, killed by a javelin. His kingdom is being torn in two. He has been shamed in so many different ways publicly. And so it just shows that there is a lot of consequences that come out of sin. The second thing that's interesting out of this story, Absalom is kind of the bad guy in the story, I guess. And so I guess it's not a bad thing that the bad guy got bad advice, but literally had he listened to Ahithophel, he probably would have won the battle. Ahithophel trusted Absalom. They were friends. They had good rapport. But Ahithophel was willing to tell him the truth. He did not stroke his ego. He did not make him feel better about himself than he should. And he was giving him wise counsel. But because Absalom was so susceptible to people that wanted to pump up his pride, he fell for this trick from Hushai, who was loyal to David, appealing to Absalom's pride. And Absalom was fooled into making a dumb decision. And so I think one takeaway from the story, I think there's a few in this story, but one takeaway for today is surround yourself with people who are going to give you wisdom. Surround yourself with people you can actually trust. And a lot of times people you can trust are people who will tell you the truth, even when it's painful and even when it's not what you want to hear. Absalom, fell for this trick from Hushai because Hushai was, just pumping him up, like making him seem better than he was. And essentially, Hushai was just lying to him. And so Absalom fell for this lie, and it cost him his life. And so it's just a reminder to us today to surround ourselves with people who will give us wise counsel. It doesn't mean they're always going to make us feel good about who we are. Actually, a lot of times wise counsel involves people calling you out and calling you up to something better. And so be sure to surround yourself with wise counselors. I'm sure we'll hear about that when we get into the Proverbs for sure. But look at the people that you listen to in your life and see if they're willing to give you good advice, if they're willing to call you out, if they're willing to set you on the right track. Because if you surround yourself with wise counselors, your life will be better off. So we'll be back again tomorrow. I'll see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.